I want to start by saying that I welcome you all here to this seminar. This seminar is today focused on the cross-border healthcare in Europe. And this seminar is a part of a larger seminar series which has been hosted by Institute of International Affairs of the University of Iceland, and also in cooperation with the European Union Information Center here in Iceland. I want to use this opportunity to mention that the next 10th of April, there will be a seminar which will focus on the EE agreement. Is it democratically viable in the current form? And I ask all the audience to look after the events of seminars regarding EEA issues and the EU issues and the connection with Iceland. But today we are will be discussing the EU new directive on cross-border healthcare, which is intended to make it easier for patients to get access to quality healthcare across EU and to increase cooperations between states when it comes to healthcare. But how has this directive, the new directive of cross-border healthcare, been implemented, and how will it impact on Iceland? Well, that is the question we are going to ask and try to answer here today. And to give us information and more knowledge about these matters, we have two distinguished guests here. First of all, we have John Rowan from the European Commission, who will give us the aspect of the and some side of the EU directive of healthcare cross-border. And then we have the Icelandic government side, which will be presented by Þórunn Oddný Steinsdóttir, a lawyer of the Ministry of Health here in Iceland. This is a new directive which is taking place as we speak in several countries, and I think it's just best to start the seminar by giving the podium to Mr. John Rowan, who leads the team working on the implementation of the cross-border healthcare directive. John Rowan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to be here today to talk about the directive. I suppose one piece of housekeeping first, in that I'm the only person who has the good fortune to be working in my native language this morning. If I get too excited or if I start speaking too quickly, please kind of wave at me if understanding is a problem, and I'll sort of calm down and slow down a little bit, because this has been known to happen occasionally. Gunnar asked me to introduce myself before going on to my presentation. So I started my career as a British civil servant in the Department of Health in London. I joined in 2006, just as the Watts case happened, which was a landmark case for cross-border healthcare. And in one way or another, the theme of cross-border healthcare has kind of either I've followed it or it's followed me around my career ever since then. I went out to Brussels in 2008 to the UK permanent representation, so the embassy to the EU, where I was the UK's negotiator on health and pharmaceuticals. So one of the things I did then was negotiate this directive. I then went to the Commission to help them implement it, and I've stayed there, so I'm a permanent Commission official now. So I've kind of been working on the theme for quite some time now. So my intention with the presentation is to start by giving some background to the directive, then to spend a little bit of time looking at the main provisions of the directive, what does it actually do, and then I'll talk a bit about the way it's been implemented in the member states and the kind of challenges and problems that we are seeing when it comes to making this directive work in practice, and then finish with a few thoughts about the impact. So the headline messages of my presentation: first, most obviously, patients' rights to choose care abroad have been, if you like, increased and also clarified. We have a clear legal framework for the use of these rights. There's a very important strand of the directive which is about information, and I'll come back to this in more detail later on. There's a sort of strand running through the directive of trying to make sure patients have the information they need to make choices about cross-border healthcare. The third point, which is significant, at least from a legal standpoint, is that we have for the first time a minimum set of patient rights in EU legislation that is supposed to apply across the EU. The difference, we can discuss whether or not that makes a real impact in practical terms, but in legal and historical terms, it's quite an important departure. And then finally, and the point I'll come back to at the end, the overall impact of the directive and the potential demand for this directive across the EU, to be very honest with you, is unclear at the moment. And I expect in the next 2 or 3 years to get much more of a sense for how much demand there is and how much patients are using this directive. So to start with some background, first of all, cross-border healthcare is not new. The directive doesn't create the idea of cross-border healthcare. We've had social security regulation since the 1970s. So I think many of you will be familiar with the European health insurance card, so kind of your card that gets you access to care when you're on holiday. I'm sure your healthcare providers here are very familiar with the European health insurance card. The regulations also covered planned healthcare. You always had to apply for prior authorization, and your home country had quite a lot of discretion to refuse your request for prior authorization. I mean, I'm simplifying this, but this is broadly where it stands. And importantly, this set of law only covers public sector providers, doesn't cover private sector providers. So that's been there as one small part of a much bigger body of social security law for quite a long time. And that was about it as far as health services went. Because remember, in the treaty says health services are a national competence. They're things that the member states do. The EU doesn't really have a role in health systems. But then what started to happen was various cases turned up in front of the European Court of Justice. And the European Court started making rulings about patient rights that were based on the idea of free movement. So that, if you like, it's single market. The single market. They were saying, okay, health services form part of the single market, and this means that patients have rights in the single market. And they developed the principles that are here on the bullet points. So you're saying patients can choose a healthcare provider abroad, get reimbursed up to the cost of that treatment in their home system. And the court said, okay, a country can use prior authorization sometimes, but not all the time. So we had these principles were developed, and these left a number of questions unanswered. Essentially, how do we make these principles work in practice? What do they mean? How is all this going to work? So there was an initial attempt to codify this jurisprudence in the Services Directive. It was very controversial, it didn't work, and the Parliament in particular said, no, we want a separate piece of legislation just dealing with this issue. So the Commission came back, put a proposal on the table. Then there was 3 years pretty much of fairly tough negotiations. They were very politically difficult. We nearly didn't get an agreement on it. And I'll come back to this again later on. There are some countries that really did not like this directive and were very much against it. And it's still politically sensitive in a number of countries. So that's the background. And now I'll spend a little bit of time just looking at the main parts of the directive. What does it actually do? So you have the right of reimbursement. This is the point that comes from the court case law, and you get reimbursed up to the cost of that treatment at home. Very importantly, the directive also says when you go to another country, it's their quality and safety standards that apply. It's their legislation that applies. If something goes wrong, you're in that system. So you have stepped out of your system, you're in the other system, it's their rules that apply. So that was one sort of very grey area that had been left by the court. And coming on to prior authorisation, by the way, the picture, I've got a couple of these. There's a European Parliament cartoon on cross-border healthcare that I've stolen some pictures from for this presentation. So that's what these squiggles are. So prior authorisation can be used. The country can insist you get prior authorisation for anything that requires an overnight stay in hospital. That might sound a bit weird, but we've inherited that from the European Court case law. And I think what the court was trying to do was to find a proxy measure to distinguish between healthcare that requires a lot of planning and investment and healthcare that kind of requires less planning and investment. So it went for overnight stay, which isn't particularly helpful in practice, but we didn't really have much room for manoeuvre with that. And it also said you can require prior authorization for highly specialized and cost-intensive healthcare. Importantly, the authorization can only be refused if there's no undue delay, which is a kind of key phrase. So you can only say no to a patient's request for authorization if you can give them that treatment in a reasonable waiting time at home. So this is also with the proviso, the treatment is one they're entitled to in their home system. So you can only say no if you can give them the treatment in a reasonable waiting time. And reasonable waiting time has got to be reasonable in the case of that individual patient. So you can't say, no, it's 6 months, and 6 months is absolutely reasonable waiting time for everybody. You have to consider the personal circumstances of the patient and make a decision. I should stress, the directive doesn't say you have to have prior authorization for this. And as things stand today, there are 8 member states who have not used prior authorization at all. They simply went, okay, we don't need it, fine, we won't bother using it. Then this slide, I think I want to take a few moments just to look at the question of information to patients, because there's a lot in the directive about information to patients. There's a real understanding that unless you tell patients, give them enough information about their rights, they can't use them. So every member state needs to create at least one national contact point to give patients information about their rights. So you have a patient here who has questions about their rights, about their reimbursement rights and so on. They contact the national contact point in their own country, who is supposed to say, okay, these are your rights, this is what you will be reimbursed, this is whether or not you need to apply for authorization, and so on. They can also contact the national contact point in the member state where they want to be treated. That contact point is supposed to say to them, okay, here's how our quality and safety system works. So, for example, here's who inspects healthcare providers to make sure they are up to scratch. Here's what happens to providers who are not up to scratch. Here's what happens if something goes wrong during your treatment. Here are your rights as a patient. And then there are also requirements for providers to provide information. The sort of things listed here, they're supposed to give information about their quality and safety. They're supposed to give information about their authorization and registration status. They are supposed to give information about the prices they charge and so on. So the directive lists a certain amount of information that providers need to give as well. In terms of the reimbursement, for incoming patients, the directive says you can't double your fees just because you're dealing with a patient from another member state. You are supposed to use the same tariff that you use for your domestic patients. There's a single market directive, this idea of non-discrimination. You can't be discriminated against on the grounds of nationality. Importantly, when working out reimbursement tariffs for patients, it is supposed to be the cost of treatment from a public or contracted provider. That's a particular issue in some member states, given their particular national contexts. And the directive also requires transparency, because if patients are going to use these rights, they need to know which treatments they are entitled to and what their reimbursement right is, how much are they going to get for each treatment. I mentioned earlier there's a minimum patient's rights. I won't look at these, I think, in great detail. I'll just put them up here. All of these are in the directive: the right of appeal, right to privacy, right to copy of medical records. In many, perhaps most countries, this doesn't necessarily change very much in practical terms. Most of these are to be found anyway in most national legislations. But I mention them because they are of legal importance. As I said, if you remember, the background to this is that originally the EU was not supposed to have very much of a role in health systems. This was something that countries did and Brussels didn't have a role in. And now we've got to a stage where you have some European law that's setting up minimum patient rights that apply everywhere across the EU. That's a fairly big step, sort of in legal and historical terms. So I think it's worth emphasising that is now where we have ended up. So again, going back, we had the social security regulations before the directive. We now have the directive, and I want to just have one slide looking at the major differences, I think, just to help understanding. I mentioned earlier the regulations only cover public sector providers. The directive covers all providers across the EU. So you're not limited just to state or public providers. You can choose private providers across the EU for your healthcare. Planned care, prior authorisation is the norm under the regulations. The idea is very much that it's the exception under the directive. And in fact, there are clauses in the directive that say that member states will need to justify the way they use prior authorisation to make sure they're not using it in a very heavy way to prevent patients accessing their rights. There is a difference in the level of cost. If you have your authorisation under the regulations, normally your cost coverage is at the level of the country of treatment, whereas with the directive you are exporting your entitlement, so you're taking your reimbursement tariff, if you like, to another country. So that can be important for patients. If you go somewhere where the cost is much higher than at home, you will have a certain amount to pay out of your own pocket. Conversely, of course, if you go somewhere where the prices are much lower at home, you may, for example, avoid having to make a co-payment. So there are real financial consequences for patients in the way they use the directive. And then the directive introduces these significant flanking measures that I've talked about. There's a lot on information, a lot on sort of certain guarantees for the patient that have not been there before. And then before I sort of go on to look at the impact and implementation, I did want to take a minute to look at the idea of cooperation between health systems that Gunnar already mentioned, because I think this is an important development. It's not necessarily linked to cross-border healthcare, but what we are starting to see is much more cooperation at EU level and EEA level between health systems on various aspects of running the health systems. So the directive talks about cooperation on guidelines for quality and safety. It also establishes the concept of European reference networks. The plan is to create networks of centres of expertise across the EU, particularly for areas kind of like rare diseases where expertise is relatively rare. And these networks will work together with patients, but they'll also act as hubs for sort of providers from other countries to tap into for experts to get access to expertise and assistance. So we're going to launch the first call for these networks at the end of this year. We see the first ones probably established next year. And I think this is quite a promising model of cooperation across the EU between highly specialised healthcare providers. Then two areas, health technology assessment and e-health. There's been a feeling for many years that these are two areas where we could do a lot more together at the EU level because countries are essentially wrestling with fairly similar problems and limited resources. So the directive creates two formal networks. Countries are all sort of coming together and meeting fairly regularly. If you like, we have a steering committee for policy in these two areas to make decisions about where we go at EU level. So again, if you think back to where we were 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, that's a fairly major development. I don't think anyone predicted we would have started doing that kind of work. The directive asks the Commission to look at cross-border healthcare in border regions, which again I think is an area that people are starting to look at. This is the era of doing more with less, and so what we're seeing is people in border regions realising you have two hospitals very close to each other duplicating services. There's probably a way of rationalising that. So we're starting to do some work in that area as well. And then finally, there's recognition of prescriptions. So the directive introduces the idea that a prescription from one EU country should be recognised in another EU country, and introduces some measures to help that happen in practice. And then moving on to challenges next steps. So the directive was supposed to be implemented by EU member states October 2013. My daily work since then and that of my team has been checking what countries have actually done and starting legal processes against the one who missed the deadline. Shockingly, a number of them missed the deadline. Unheard of, that never happened. So that's very much what we're doing at the moment, and we're kind of knee-deep in the details of the way that countries have put this into practice. So I'd like to talk about, for me, what I see as some of the challenges of doing this. There's a big one is awareness. These, by the way, are from a Eurobarometer study that we have commissioned. This hasn't yet been published. We expect to publish this, I think, in the next month or two. But some of the results, I think, are quite striking. So when you ask people if they would be willing to travel to another country, a relatively high number of people say yes. 33%. For me, that's quite a high number. I'm surprised that so many people would say yes. But then you look at the reasons they want to travel to another country, by far the sort of most popular answer is to get treatment that's not available at home. Well, already you're outside of the terms of the directive. So clearly one of the drivers for people to seek treatment abroad, or one of the demands, is something the directive is not going to respond to. But then there are a number of others where clearly the directive could respond to this, so to receive better quality treatment, or particularly to receive treatment more quickly. Looking again at awareness, so this was asking people, do you know that there's a national contact point in your country? So at one in Malta, 24% of people said yes, and then only 6% of people in the UK said yes, we know about the contact point. So, I mean, there's a certain amount of variation, but the red bit of this chart is a lot bigger than the blue bit of this chart. So is the obvious conclusion from this. So there's an awareness problem here. And again, if you ask people to what extent are you informed about the healthcare you get in your country and then in another EU country, there's a really significant difference between the two. And again, I mean, a significant amount of variation across the EU, but nevertheless, people clearly don't. Oh, there's a dearth of information about your rights. And then, sorry, the text is too small, but essentially we asked people 3 different questions, and this was the percentage of places where at least 2 questions were answered correctly. So Luxembourg and Sweden did brilliantly, and then Bulgaria and Portugal did very poorly. So again, very, very wide variation in terms of people knowing about their rights and able to use them. So that, if I'm being very honest, from my point of view, that's my biggest challenge right now. We have this directive, we have it in place, but if people don't know about their rights, how are they ever going to use them? So my personal priority, I think, is tackling this issue. Then in terms of the practicalities of the implementation of the directive, for one thing, as you've seen from the presentation, we have 2 bits of EU law dealing with cross-border healthcare that overlap but work in different ways at times. That is not an ideal situation. If we were starting from a blank piece of paper, we would never design the system that we have now. But we didn't start from a blank piece of paper. We've sort of arrived at here through a number of almost historical accidents. So we have quite a complex legal situation. And how do we try and explain this to the patient? I mean, most patients don't want to know about, is it the regulations, is it the directive? They want to know, can I go, am I going to get my costs covered, and so on. So how do we explain a complex legal situation in a way people can easily understand? There are problems with how do we assess undue delay. You know, how do you carry out an individual assessment of somebody and work out what a reasonable waiting time is for them for a given treatment? And then how do patients know what treatments they're entitled to? I have experience personally of 2 health systems in the UK, where I'm from, and Belgium, where I live. So in Belgium, there's a list of 4,000 treatments, and it's like, those are what you can get. You know, everything is detailed to an incredible level of detail. And in the UK, what you get is whatever your local doctor gives you when you go along. He says, oh, okay, fine. There's no information set out anywhere. They operate in completely different ways. So for some countries, this communication to patients of what their entitlements are is culturally, technically, a sort of new departure. It's not something they're used to doing at all. Whereas for other countries, they've been doing it, you know, for years and years and years, and it's second nature. So some countries, that's very difficult. Prices and tariffs, sorry. This is another excerpt from the European Parliament cartoon showing Hitler at a hospital reimbursement desk. It's most peculiar. Again, what's the tariff for reimbursement? Countries that have a social insurance-based system, again, they know what reimbursement tariffs are. They're used to dealing with this the whole time. For other countries, NHS-type systems, it can be a lot more difficult to identify what the tariff is they're going to use for reimbursement. And similarly, the tariff they're going to use for incoming patients. That's not just an NHS problem. So you have, for example, in Belgium, in Flanders, so the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, you have a lot of Dutch patients coming to use the hospitals in Belgium. 1, they have overcapacity in that part of Belgium, and 2, the tariffs are artificially low because there's a certain amount of funding they get from central government, so the tariffs they charge don't reflect the cost of treatment. So now the Belgians are going, well, hang on, we're sort of subsidising the Dutch patients who are coming over here from our central government funding. So it's starting to put some pressure on internal arrangements. But then, of course, if you say, well, okay, we need to raise the tariffs to reflect this thing, then you would normally expect the reimbursement tariffs for Belgian patients to increase as well, because clearly there needs to be a relationship between the two. So some countries are wrestling with this and this thing of how to ensure non-discrimination. Then information. Who is best placed to be the national contact point? What information should they give? Classically on quality and safety, how do you give information on quality and safety in a way that people can understand and use? And this is a big debate that's going on across the world right now. How do you give information on quality and safety of healthcare, and how should contact points work together? And then again, what information should providers give about quality and safety? And I mean, this is not necessarily related to the directive. Okay, at the time we are living in, we are seeing, with sort of the possibilities offered by technology, a great push for transparency and increased information. And the health sector is one famously where there is this asymmetry of information between sort of providers and patients. Well, does technology redress that? And if we think, as people who work in health policy, that kind of TripAdvisor and Amazon reviews for hospitals are not on the way very soon, we are kidding ourselves. This is clearly where we are going, and we're going to have to tackle this. Now, some countries hate this. The Netherlands are bringing this in. The Netherlands are going to do TripAdvisor for hospitals. Fine. They're very relaxed about this. You mention this to the Germans, they go mad. They think this is a horrible idea, and absolutely we shouldn't be doing this, and it's going to, it's barbarism. So we have very different cultural approaches to transparency and quality and safety. And I said this is not necessarily to do with the directive, this is just happening anyway. But what we have is we have our network of national contact points, who are people in each country responsible for trying to provide information and dealing with information in the very near future. So then the impact of the directive. Now, I said to be seen because at the moment we don't yet know. We're doing a data collection exercise at the moment. We've asked member states to say to us, what's happening, how many patients are travelling and so on. But I'll be honest, we're just trying to establish a kind of zero baseline at the moment because nobody's ever collected this data before. So it's going to require a number of years of tracking this before we have a real picture of the impact. And of course, bearing in mind what I was saying earlier about awareness, we won't know what the real demand for this is until we know that enough patients are informed about it to be making informed choices. So my best guess is that overall there are potentially significant impacts for individuals here, but at a system level I'm not sure that we will see huge impacts. John particularly asked me to say a few words about some real life examples. So in terms of my travels around the EU looking at this subject, the kind of things that we are seeing. In Ireland, I was talking to patients with rare diseases who see this directive as being an excellent way of accessing diagnostic services quicker, because it takes a long time to process blood tests in Ireland. They can send them over to the UK, get them done in a matter of days. That's not subject to prior authorization, so they can do that very quickly. So that's a very concrete, real-life example. I think we're seeing some border regions, particularly where there are relatively few linguistic differences on either side of the border, where people will vote with their feet and go to their nearest provider. So I'm thinking of the Franco-German border particularly. People on the border tend to be able to cope with both languages. Tariffs are broadly similar, so you're not talking about huge financial differences. And there are quite a lot of areas where the nearest hospital is just the other side of the border rather than 50 kilometres the other direction. So I think we'll see significant patient flows in those areas. And then there's an interesting question, does that act as a driver for configuration in those areas? Do kind of policymakers start looking at it and saying, well, hang on a minute, why don't we just rationalise this? Why don't we take this into account in our planning and make cross-border healthcare just something that we do naturally? So it will be interesting to see whether that happens. I think that there will be room for some entrepreneurial behaviour. I've met a couple of people. I met a guy in Poland who's moved across the border and bought a hospital that's 2 kilometres across the border into the Czech Republic because he intends to open a centre there for things where he can get Polish patients over. So he's doing that deliberately. He thinks there's a business model for him there. The number of patients, again, in terms of the overall Polish health system, isn't huge, but you could see a significant number of people going there. My guess is that those will be relatively straightforward, relatively low cost, high volume kind of treatments, things like hip replacements, cataracts, where there are significant waiting lists in some countries. They make a big difference to quality of life if you can get them done more quickly. And so I think we'll see that sort of thing happening as well. And then finally, I think the other real-life impact we've seen in things where patients face significant co-payments. So, for example, in France at the moment, increasingly patients have to pay quite hefty co-payments for dentistry. So what we're seeing is quite a flow of patients from France to Hungary to get their dental treatment, because if they go there, they save themselves the co-payment, essentially, because it'll be covered by the French tariff. So that we're seeing as well. So those are all sort of real-life examples that I've seen over the last couple of years of things that people are actually doing. I said localised impacts could indeed be far more significant. And then my final thought, I sometimes wonder whether the provisions we have on information could be of more universal significance in the end. Because I've spoken to a number of patient groups where even if they're not necessarily looking to use cross-border healthcare, what they're interested in is using the requirements of the directive that their own system be more transparent in a variety of ways and putting pressure on their home system to deliver this transparency. So they're looking at the cross-border healthcare directive in a very different way. And so I wonder whether ultimately that may be of more importance in some countries. So very quickly then, next steps, we are checking the way member states have put this into national law. Essentially, we've spent the last 18 months making sure they've done everything the directive requires them to do. We're now getting into the meat of this. Not only have they done it, but have they done it properly? And that could obviously end up in the legal processes that we have. We will be doing a report. This is a public report by October this year. That's officially a report to Parliament and Council about the way the directive is being implemented. So that will contain some tentative conclusions. That's the presentation. Thank you very much.